Good evening. In the last episode, we saw how the Roman Empire came ingloriously to an inglorious end, officially in 478 AD, when the barbarian king Odoacer deposed the boy Emperor Augustulus. The attributed name Augustulus, which is the diminutive of Augustus, was meant to show his irrelevance. Now officially, the end of the western branch of the Roman Empire coincides with the beginning of the Middle Ages, of the High Middle Ages, also referred to by some historians as the Dark Centuries. Now, labels are often necessary and useful to set mileposts, so to speak, or to assign a place and time to significant or dramatic historical events, whose effects have a noticeable influence long after those events took place. At the same time, historical labels tend to limit an understanding of the whole, a comprehensive vision, a vision that enables you, us, some of us at least, to say to ourselves, I think I understand what was going on, or something similar. In the instance, nothing much happened the day before Augustulus was deposed, nor the day after. In fact, even if we look at Rome herself, it is not at all clear that things were as bad as the end of an empire may cause us to think that they were. Actually, we have two quite different versions of what we assume was the agonizing city of Rome. The senator Symmachus, in fact, gives us quite a positive description of a Rome that was no longer capital of the Western Roman Empire. Symmachus was still a pagan, or perhaps an agnostic. The Rome he describes to us in his letter reflects the life of the rich and privileged, the holders of important sounding position, though in effect these positions were now only symbolic. In his view, in the view of Symmachus, that Rome is still the intellectual capital of the West. The palaces of the rich are filled with books and artistic displays, and as Shakespeare would say, Epicurean cooks sharpen with cloyless sauce their appetite, meaning the appetite of their masters. It is not, however, a closed or restricted society. In fact, the rich still finance the bread and circuses for the benefit of the unthinking masses, and we could say perhaps like then, like now. On the other hand, another historian, Salvianus from Marseille, gives us quite a different picture of the same city. In his book, The Government of God, Salvianus sees Rome as a den of oppression, corruption, and immorality. Compared to the Romans, he says, the barbarians are better because they are held together by a spirit of sacrifice, a sense of solidarity and brotherhood, and by the law of honor. He says, Rome dies and laughs. Now, who is right? We may ask. Probably they both are, because the decadence of empire is marked by some common characteristics, which are an increased chasm between a more restricted, privileged few and the rest of the population, an increasing mass of the disenfranchised, and the weakening of a general feel of solidarity, and a total indifference to the interests of the community as long as the interests of the privileges are protected. At the official end of her imperial glory, Rome maybe had 200,000 inhabitants. It had become essentially an oriental city, living parasitically on the revenue coming in from the provinces of the empire, with the exception of a few piddling manufacturing establishments. Their main industries were politics and plunder. But the good times were over. Ever since Constantinople monopolized the oriental market and the barbarians had paralyzed the western markets. This was accompanied by a demographic decline and above all, by the decline of what we call the middle class. The fiscal policy was heavy on the poor, both through direct and indirect taxation, while being light on the rich. For the first time, already in the 3rd century, some Roman citizens escaped beyond the limes, which was, as you know, the Iron Curtain of the time, and took refuge among the barbarians. Now, Two events occurred simultaneously: the increase in the bureaucracy and the reduction of the taxpayer's role, the reduction of the middle class. Unable to keep up with the taxes, the farmers sold their property or their small farms to the large landowners. The farmers still worked the same land, but they had been transformed from landholders to serfs of the soil. Historically, and from the point of view of social changes and social dislocation, this was the real beginning of the Middle Ages. Because ever since the end of Rome as a world power, there were no more slaves coming to Rome. Therefore, the large landholders were quite happy to hire the farmers as serfs after having purchased their farms. In turn, for the ex-farmers, it was better to have a master for two reasons: to escape from the taxman and to have a protector of sorts, as law and order, as we would say today, was collapsing in proportion as the empire was dissolving. The rich landowner, who until then commuted from his palace in Rome to his estate in the country, changes physiognomy, or perhaps we could say he changes status. He became the powerful man, the godfather, a feudal lord, who assumes within himself, and almost by default, what we could call political, autocratic, and judicial power. Beforehand, the country estate, the villa, was an escape from the city. It changed from the luxuries of the cities to the delight of country life. And Roman prefects, Roman troops, and Roman generals ensured the protection of the estate. But now, the former protection was gone, and the villa gradually turned into a fortified structure, a fort, and gradually from a fort into a castle. Competing bands of soldiers roamed the countryside. Some were fully fledged barbarians, some were barbarians who had become federati, that is, loosely associated with Rome. But from the point of view of looting, there was little difference, if any, between them. On the other hand, there was another important distinction between barbarian feudalism and the feudalism that relatively quickly took hold in Italy. In Italy, the ex-farmer at the service of the feudal master replaced the slave, and the Roman feudal master treated him as such, as a slave. In other words, the man at the service of the master is not a vassal, he is indeed a slave. Sometimes words tell us more than they seem to mean. Both the word vassal and the word slave refer to someone being a subject to someone else. But the actual difference is very significant, which is one of the reasons why it fell on the barbarians to found, or if you like, or to re-establish the sacred Roman Empire 300 years later in the year 800 AD with, as you know, Charlemagne. For the barbarians were not used to have or keep slaves. The leadership exercised by the barbarians was a leadership over their brothers. That is, it was inherently more humane. In Rome, rather instead, and as a rule, and with some usual notable exceptions, but they are exceptions, masters had total control on the life and death of their slaves, which also suggests an implicit attitude of contempt. As an example, Paulinus of Pella was a Christian poet of the 5th century, the century when Rome officially ceased to be the capital of an empire, and he wrote an autobiographical poem called Eucharistikos, which is a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. And this Paulinus of Pella congratulates himself for being a moral man. Why? Why, you may ask? Because he contented himself. As far as concubines were concerned, he contented himself with slaves, which for him was the right thing to do. These conditions explain why Roman feudalism, if we can so call it, soon disappeared, while barbarian feudalism, if we wish to call it barbarian, took hold in the lands that earlier formed the Western Roman Empire. Now, one of the critical cultural characteristics of barbarian feudalism was, as I said, the replacement of the bond between master and slave, the replacement with an independent relationship between two different entities. The seigneur, or seigneur, a new word indicating one who in power and status is above the vassals, but is not his master, and the vassal himself. This relationship, at least in principle, was based on the concept of honor. In turn, honor is associated with nobility of spirit, courage in battle, and, as hopefully we will see later, a sense of respect towards woman. Out of this set of values, as we would call them today, grew essentially a new civilization. Roughly speaking, it took 300 years for the turbulent waters of history to settle long enough to give rise to the sacred Roman Empire, born in the year, as I said, year 800 with Charlemagne. And it is equally meaningful that the empire born with Charlemagne died only at the end of World War I, the first European Civil War, with the end of the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Some viewer may ask, how about the battles between feudal lords? The 100 Years' War in England and France, the rebellions, the religious heresies, the establishment of the Central European kingdoms, France, Spain, England, even Sweden, or the split between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church in 1054 AD. And how about the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation? Yes, could be an answer, all this happened. But the concept of nobility as embodying an ideal to strive for by a man, any man, never died, irrespective of how much the concept may have been abused. We could even say that the Romantic movement that flourished in the 19th century and its emphasis on the history, values, rituals, and traditions of the Middle Ages, including the respect and idealization of women, was the last reaffirmation of the founding values of barbarian feudalism. In fact, even today, the titles of Count, Duke, Marquess, Esquire, and others still exist in many European countries. Legally, the titles have no value, but historically and spiritually, they remind their holders, especially the heir of old historic families, the titles remind them that once upon a time, either the bravery or the loyalty or some noble act or even a sacrifice had gained this or that title to their ancestors. Now, this is not an idealization of the feudal system, or for that matter, an idealization of the barbarians. The idealization of woman actually occurred in the middle of the Middle Ages, about the year 1100-1200 AD, and it coincided with the establishment of the Mother of Christ as the most influential symbol of Christianity after Christ himself. However, even in the early Middle Ages, women held a position of influence and actual leadership and power. In previous episodes, we saw, for example, Empress Justina, Empress Galla Placidia, and there were others. But the feudal system also meant that the feudal lords almost constantly fought against each other, and those who suffered, the workers of the land, took the brunt of this state of constant or unpredictable hostilities. To reduce the risk of being invaded, ransacked, and or killed, the Middle Ages inhabitants of Italy resorted to a remedy that we can still see and verify today, namely the creation of the structure and of the landscape of Italy itself. One way to discourage marauders, soldiers, and invaders from attacking a town or a hamlet was to build it on top of hills. There were no other modes of transportation available than hand-drawn carriages, or horse-drawn or oxen-drawn carts and carriages. The idea of climbing a steep hill or a mountain to rob a population without even knowing if the inhabitants had anything much worth robbing was often sufficient to dissuade the barbarian bands, whether independent or at the service of this or that feudal lord. and discourage them from undertaking the climb. And even more so if the town had protective walls around it. We could say that gravity was a form of natural defense. But this defense also helped create or lay the foundation for the fascinating landscape of little towns on top of hills, which have and still fascinate those tourists who wish to know more of Italy than the classical destinations that when the would-be tourist thinks of Italy, which are usually, as you know, Rome, Florence, and Venice. I know I'm making sweeping generalizations, but this is just to show that the transition from the Roman Empire to the feudal system was not only a transfer of power or systems of power, but a deep cultural revolution whose values lingered in Europe and are still traceable today. I mentioned the value system that linked the feudal lord and his vassals as a characteristic of the Middle Ages, and this does not prevent Italy, and Europe for that matter, from becoming a battleground between warring feudal lords. And it is not coincidental that the word feud to mean a battle between contesting factions is a term belonging to most European languages. Gregory, Bishop of Tours, gives us an interesting perspective on the Middle Age life in what is today France and what then was Gaul, called Gaul. Gregory was a bishop who wrote a history of the Franks. Actually, it was a history of the world, starting from creation down to his days. Murder, treason, killing among brothers, adultery, incest, mother killing daughters for fear to be supplanted in the graces of their lovers. If there is a crime, you will find it in the history of the Franks. Gregory knew at least 4 of the Frankish feudal kings and had severe issues with one of them called Chilperic. After learning that Gregory had slandered his wife, Chilperic had Gregory arrested and tried for treason, and Gregory barely escaped execution. But Gregory survived Chilperic, and in his books he lambasts him, comparing him to Nero and Herod. I've spoken of the development of the feudal system as the most characteristic cultural and sociological, if you like, signature of what we call the Middle Ages. Equally important, or actually even more important for us ethnic Europeans, was the influence of the Church, and more specifically the importance of that the Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries or abbeys had on the development of European culture, science, and technology. The first founder of a medieval abbey was St. Benedict in 520 AD, barely 30 years after the banishment from Rome of the last nominal emperor Augustulus in 478 AD, as we saw before. Benedict founded his abbey on the top of Monte Cassino, southeast of Rome, and as you know, the original abbey was destroyed during World War II, which was really the second European Civil War, after the first Civil War of 1914-1918. We are currently in the third and maybe final civil war against people of European ethnicity, but it is politically incorrect to say so openly. St. Benedict did not just found an abbey, but created an order whose operating slogan or motto was Ora et Labora, pray and work. This order, the Benedictine and later the Cistercian order, founded in 1098 in Burgundy by Robert of Molesme, were to play a critical role in the development of European civilization. And this for a number of different but connected reasons, all equally important. In a world left chaotic after the collapse of law and order, as we would say today, following the end of the Roman Empire, the monasteries offer the next best thing, a refuge, a message of hope and salvation in this life and in the next. One had just to look around and easily convince himself that humanity was sinking under the burden of its own guilt. The Church, or better, Christ, was the only salvation from the guilt of a degenerate humanity. And it was a powerful argument, for while disorder, chaos, and lawlessness were rampant, the only islands of civilization and culture were to be found in the monasteries. The Latin culture, the arts, and the tradition could not be preserved in the cities that were praised to turbulence and lawlessness, but rather in these monasteries, which we can call enclaves of civilization. And so it came to pass that the monks were the actual founders of medieval culture. But there can be no culture without some kind of order, and in 529 AD, Benedict issued the rather strict rules of Benedictine order. Many centuries later, a French philosopher wrote that it is the lack of order that makes us slaves. The Benedictine order and discipline were centered around the famous line, as I said before, ora et labora, work and pray, a way to give order to life. The Benedictines also took vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity. Plus, no private property, strict vegetarianism, continued labor, and enforced residence within the monastery itself. Every monk had to pray at least 4 hours a day, with more hours spent reading by those monks who could not read. Soon more monasteries sprung everywhere in Europe, often in places that are relatively remote even by today's standards. St. Columban, for example, traveled all the way from Ireland to the remote community of Bobbio, about 50 miles from the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. To reach the monastery even today, you have to drive through 50 miles of switchbacks along the beautiful valley of the river Trebbia. Or take this other one. For example, St. Peter in the Valley, in the region of Umbria. It is located in the remote branch of a valley that is already remote to begin with, even by today's standard. The monks were great constructors and farmers. Where they operated, they built magnificent Romanesque and Gothic architectural jewels. Actually, equally, they transformed the surrounding lands, making them fertile and sources of life and sustenance for the community of men. For over 1500 years, ora et labora, as I said, pray and work, have been words expressing the spirit that kindled the development of the European civilization. Monasteries have inspired a strong and profound faith, and the monks learned how to best employ the scientific knowledge they acquired so as to convert bogs into arable lands and rocks into homes. And they did this through a careful observation of nature and her environment, to which they added the study and practice of ancient medical knowledge, philosophy, and astronomy. Here is a medieval miniature showing some dentists of the age exercising their profession. And here is another abbey, Staffarda, which, like other abbeys, represents the convergence of an artistic, cultural, theological, and human patrimony that illuminated an age that could be appropriately be defined as dark. The monks had to develop and test their skills in dealing with the necessities concerning the management of the territory, land surveying, topography, the study of waters, the handling of goods and money, the building of functional structures and irrigation canals, and all aimed at linking the human with the divine and theological experience. Sometimes between the 6th and the 9th century, the plow with wheels was invented, which made the job of preparing the earth for sowing that much easier. And the crank was invented, which may actually have been copied from the Arabs, the Muslims, who invaded Europe in the 7th century, and were stopped in their advance by Charles Martel at Poitiers in 732 AD. In general, the monastic systems sowed the seed and they undertook the task of taming and educating the untamed and the uneducated. Under the impulse of this earlier development, other progress and improvements took place, as you can see in this miniature, representing a rural scene of productive activities and showing some of the advances that brought forward what we generally call civilization. Some historians actually connect the traditionally acknowledged work discipline and skill of the Germans in manufacturing, design and innovation to the large number of abbeys throughout the land, which helped inspire what we can broadly call the spirit of patient labor. In Germany, but also in many other European countries, wherever this happened, wherever abbeys grew and flourished. Therefore, Europeans, as an ethnic group, carry within themselves the spirit and the distillate of the work of centuries. For not everything that exists we can touch. The notion that all races are equal is, in my view, questionable, and the coarse and crass imposition of integration and miscegenation as the penalty to pay for colonialism of earlier Europeans is an aberrant, malignant, and malicious notion floated by a specific sect of social engineers bent upon the destruction of the European ethnicity. But I digress. Between 478 AD and the year 800 AD, there was in Italy a succession of what came to be known as barbarian kingdoms, belonging to a successive line of barbarians. First the Goths, whom we have already met, followed by the Longobards, from whom the Italian region of Lombardy takes its name, and finally the Franks, whose most famous emperor, Charlemagne, inaugurated, we could say, a new era in the Western world. As a eulogy to the Roman Empire, its culture, even after its collapse, remained a beacon, a blueprint for what we call civilization. It is true, many factors contributed to the Roman Renaissance under the standards of Charlemagne. Importantly, the Church in Italy and in the Eastern Roman Empire took over many of Rome's cultural symbols and structures. But the key point is that Rome died as an empire, but not as a forger of civilization. Next time, we will look at what happened in the 300 years or so between the end of Rome as a capital of an empire and the crowning of Charlemagne. In Rome, in the old St. Peter's Basilica, the crowning took place. Until then, I am Jim Amolia for Historical Sketches. Good night.